Where's Mum?
G'day, I'm here in Menzies Creek, not Mackenzie's Creek, Menzies Creek in the Dandenongs, just out the back of Melbourne. Look it up on Google Maps. A beautiful place, a beautiful part of out of suburbs of Melbourne. I'm here with Charlie.
G'day.
And look at Finn. Hello, Finn. This is Finn.
Wants to face the camera.
And Charlie, have a look up Charlie's company, Hyundai Australasia. Charlie's the director of Hyundai, and they make serious woodworking machines. Anyway, enjoy this video.
Thank you.
Well, g'day. Today I wanted to show you how I made this. Now this is obviously a grinder, but it's been made out of an old bull oak fence post. Now, bull oak is a timber that is common around my way, that is in Western Victoria, in the Wimmera. It was a favoured timber for fence posts because it was is a very hard and durable timber. So very popular for fence posts. Now the ones I got were well past their use by date, so I managed to score quite a few of them, and they've got this beautiful lichen down here, some weathering, holes in them, etc. And I've encased this in resin, and when that resin has been cured, I have turned it on the lathe. Now I won't be going through the whole process because the whole process of making a grinder has been covered in other videos. I want to look at really just the handful of techniques that are peculiar to turning resin and wood. And I'll also look at a couple of ways that I finish this compound. As to the resin work, well, I'll only look at that briefly. Once again, there's a lot of information on videos, particularly Resin and Wood episode 1, covering the techniques that I use, or many of the techniques that I've used to cast up something like that bull oak fence post. So let's go into my resin area and we'll have a look at how I prepared the blank. Now the following process I use to ensure that there is both a bubble-free and airlock-free casting. Now those two things are quite different. I use PVC pipe for my mould, in which I put my blank piece of wood. Here it is. Here's a section of the fence post, the bull oak fence post with the lichen down it, that I've turned to fit inside the PVC pipe. Now that PVC pipe is, I know, internal diameter 72 millimeters. Now that's a little under 3 inches. I'm not exactly sure of the imperial conversion there. To make sure that the resin doesn't flow out the bottom, I put a timber plug there. So there's my timber plug that I then use some masking tape. So I've got some masking tape over there that I used to seal that seam down the bottom. Once that is done, in goes the epoxy resin. It's as simple as that really, except number one, I do 3 pours. Now the 3 pours are, I've found to be the best way of getting a bubble-free mixture, and especially an airlock-free mixture, or casting I should say. So I do 3 pours, and just remember that the resin will chemically adhere to itself if one layer is poured onto the second layer is poured onto the first layer within, let's say, 24, 48 hours. Now once the resin has been poured in there, the whole lot then goes into my vacuum chamber. So I have got a vacuum chamber that sucks a lot of the air out and helps the resin to penetrate not only all the nooks and crannies and the cracks and whatever else, but also the pores of the timber and the pores of the lichen itself. So into the vacuum chamber, I've got quite a big vacuum chamber here, and then once it's been in there for about half an hour, then into the pressure chamber. The pressure chamber squashes, bursts any bubbles that are left in the mixture. It also helps to force any of the resin up into any of those airlocks or cavities or whatever else that hasn't been quite filled with the resin already. So that's the casting in a nutshell. Let's go back in and have a look at the turning. Now turning wood and resin is very similar to turning just straight wood. Most of the techniques that I would use to turn a solid wood grinder, for instance, I use on the resin and wood grinder. I sand it, I drill it, I turn it more or less exactly the same way. using the same sort of techniques with some exceptions. So let's have a look at those. First of all, I would recommend using one of these tungsten carbide tip tools. They are quite common nowadays. Now if you haven't got one of these, high-speed steel tools still could be used, yes, but you just will need to make sure that you're good at sharpening, because you will need to sharpen the tools quite regularly. You will also need a range of sandpaper right up to at least 1200, if not finer. And before you start turning, you might want to have a bit of a clean up around your lathe. I like usually to gather my shavings, the timber shavings, and put them in the composter or on the garden or whatever. When I have got resin mixed in with those shavings, I obviously can't put them on the garden or even in the chook pen or wherever else. I need to put them in the bin. So a clean up before you start might be worthwhile. Now here is my blank mounted on the lathe, and this is the bit that I cut from the top here, so that was joined on there, something like that. I used a drop saw just to cut that off, although that could have been done on the lathe. Now that was done in the video series that showed how to make a grinder. Anyway, I can put that to one side and I can start the turning. So I've got my tungsten carbide tip tool here, and I'll use that for most of my shaping. Lathe speed. You don't need the lathe going really fast. That's going at around about 1200 RPM, perhaps a little bit faster or a little bit slower would be fine. But generally speaking, when you do get hard substances or hard materials, hard timber or whatever else it is, and this is hard, this resin and bull oak combination is very hard. Generally speaking, the harder the material is, the slower that you want to go with your speed. So yes, I could be spinning this at 3000 RPM, but because it is hard, I'll be going slow. Now I tend to do a lot of scraping with these. Cutting just it tends to, well, I haven't got any cutting tools that are tungsten carbide, so I tend to do a lot of scraping, and this particular tool, these carbide tipped tools, are best, I reckon, used on an angle like this. So we are scraping like that rather than just presenting the tool like that, which I think is just a bit too aggressive, and it can result in some nasty chip outs when we come to do the resin. I'd prefer to hold the tool like that. So it's on an angle. Now that angle there, if I were to put a ruler across here like so, that angle, that is the angle that this ruler might make with the floor or the lathe of the bed, might be around about 45 degrees. Doesn't have to be 45, just approximately. Coming back the other way. Now this blank is out of true a little bit, so I am not pushing hard into the material, or I'll just get that constant vibration. What I tend to do is push hard down on the tool rest and let the material or the wood, the resin, come onto the tool. I'll put that aside just for a minute. I'll grab a scraper. Here's the scraper, just a round nose scraper. I need to pull that tool rest just away a little bit from the wood, the material, the blank. I could use a scraper, but when I use a scraper, you'll notice, and I'll just stop the lathe and I'll show you what's going on here. It is tending to chip. You can see the difference between here and these chips and over here where there's not the chips. Now remember, that was cut with that carbide tip tool on an angle, and this was just a scraping. Now what I could do is better, is actually angle the scraper down, and that is a far less aggressive way of scraping. Now I've got the, you probably can't, well I know you can't see this, but I know you can't see this, but I've got the end of the tool, the handle itself, almost under my armpit. So the tool is really angled downwards quite steeply. Now that is negative rake. And whenever you negative rake something, and whenever you present this cutting edge at a negative rake, you are cutting or taking the material off in a far more gentle way And this stuff, this resin especially, is going to be less inclined to chip. We can use a skew chisel, either like that, or a more traditional way, which is more like that. And that is not a bad way of going. If you are competent with your skew chisel, haven't got a tungsten carbide tipped tool, then this isn't such a bad way to go, but it's very slow going, that's the only thing. But if you're not in a rush, there's no problem with that. And you will cut nice and cleanly, and you won't have any of that chipping out. So they're basically the techniques that I use when shaping the timber and resin combination. Hopefully I'll keep a fair bit of this lichen through here as I shape it. So as I say, get back to the tungsten carbide tipped tool and start shaping. So this is 80 grit, and I'm going to use this 80 grit until all of the ridges are out. And I'll just stop the lathe, and you'll see a few marks in here that need to come out. This mark here, these marks here, those sort of white flecks in there, they all need to come out. The resin sands up quite quickly. It's the timber that's causing me the trouble at the moment. One of my favourite sanding tools are these inertia sanders. Now this is 120 grit. The thing I like about the inertia sanders is that the scratches that are left behind are very random. And this is, as I say, 120 grit. Let's have a look at the scratches on here. You can see them particularly on here, but on the wood, have a look at that. You can barely see the scratches. So inertia sanders. This is made by Vermec in Brisbane, Australia. Best one I've ever used. I can't destroy this one. This has got a 3-inch pad on there. Okay, this is 500 grit. Just finishing off with a 500. And that's as far as I can go with my inertia sander because I haven't got any finer sandpaper for those. So I'll just turn that off. And one thing I really like, I've discovered recently, is this stuff called Abranet. It's made by Mercer. It's called Abranet. This is 600 grit. It's a mesh. It's a abrasive mesh. So I've slowed the lathe down, 600. The thing about this mesh is that it doesn't get clogged, so you can just flick it like so and it unclogs itself. I find this Abranet particularly good for sanding between coats of lacquer. The lacquer tends to clog traditional sandpaper, whereas the Abranet, as I say, you can just flick it and give it a whack and it cleans itself. So this is 600. Let's have a look at how that's looking. No terrible scratches. Doesn't hurt it with spindle turning to sand with the grain. The timber, the bull oak itself, has come up beautifully already. It really is the resin that we're worrying about and getting all of our scratches out of our resin. And just every so often, it's a good idea to turn your lathe off and make sure you haven't left any deeper scratches from a previous grit. So if I want this resin here to come up nice and glassy, I've got to do a bit of sanding. I've got to go through the grits. And then when you do that, that lichen here can be seen underneath the resin because the resin ends up being like glass. Okay, so that's 600. Now I'm going to go to some wet and dry 800 and then some 1200. So here's the wet and dry 800, then I'll finish off with 1200. Slow the lathe down. Now my next step is to use this stuff here, U-Buttes polishes, Triple E Ultra Shine, and it's a polishing paste or wax. I don't need a lot. There's some, that's probably even a bit too much, but I find that I've been told that I shouldn't use this much, but I'm going to just wipe it on all the way around, get a lot on there. Now this has got a cutting compound in it, so you can feel a bit of a grit to it. Once that's on, once you've wiped it on, remember, wipe it on without the lathe going, because otherwise it just splatters everywhere and you get more on your clothes than on the wood itself. I can turn the lathe on, and I'm still using that area of the rag that I used to apply it, and I'm just going to go backwards and forwards. And this cutting compound in the polishing wax is going to break down finer and finer and effectively sand or polish the resin finer and finer, and getting it into that glass look, which is what I'm after. Let's have a look at that, looking a bit messy. I'm suggesting that I probably put too much on there, way too much. But it doesn't matter because it will come off. Now I'm still using that same section of rag that I applied the initial coat of the Triple E with. I'm just wiping off a lot of that excess. And now I'm going to get a fresh section of rag and polish that up. And you can start to see this turning out like glass. We can see right through those holes there into my chuck underneath. It's looking good. Get a clean rag and some shallow wax. So this is the shallow wax made by the same company, U-Butte. Now this stuff you don't need a lot. The more you put on, the worse it becomes to some extent. You put too much on and it doesn't look very good. So I just put about the size of a 10-cent piece on there and wiping that around by hand. Now this is a friction polish, so what actually dries it or cures it is friction, is heat. So initially we need to spread it out. We need to spread it out before we start to set it off. So that's why I'm doing this by hand initially. Then we can turn it on using that same section of rag to just even out the spread of that stuff, the shallow wax. Just light pressure, and then a fresh section of the rag. Let's have a look at that. And there we have our bull oak grinder. Now I've just stripped all the shallow wax off there because I wanted to show you the second technique that I use to finish these. In fact, I tend to use this next technique, which is spraying it with a nitrocellulose lacquer, as my preferred technique. It's very quick, and I actually don't have to sand so much to get a pretty good looking finish on these. So we'll get this off the chuck and take this outside to where my spray booth is, and I'll give this a quick spray of the lacquer and we'll have a look at how that comes up. Now this is my high-tech spray area. I have got an old ironing board that I use to spray all my stuff on. It's very convenient. I can alter the height according to how tall my pieces are. I've got this turntable, very handy to spin the work. I've got this on which sits this plug on which goes the grinder. So this plug has got an inch spigot here that slightly tapers outwards, so that acts as a wedge as I push that in there, and then that can sit there like that. Over here I've got my spray gun on a very high-tech holder made out of a piece of PVC pipe. Convenient spot, so once I've finished spraying I can just put my spray gun there. The lacquer that I use is called a nitrocellulose lacquer, one pack lacquer. Many proprietary brands, different brands. I use a thing called Pylon high-tech semi-gloss clear. Now there's lots of other brands out there, you've got to check them out. Also you could check out one of my very earlier videos in which I do talk about the lacquer, why I use what I use, why I think it's a great method of finishing. So check out that video. Anyway, let's see what the lacquer looks like when I spray this grinder. Okay, so there it is, the bull oak fence post grinder. Now I obviously haven't shown you how to make the knob. Once again, refer to those videos that I have already made on making a grinder, and you'll see exactly how to make the knob, and the techniques that I used for the body will be applied to the knob. That's it for now. I'll see you another time, and safe turning.